Hi everyone. I want to talk about an extremely important subject, free speech. It's certainly a subject that I've covered before, but frankly, it's always relevant because it's something that we can never be complacent about. Now, I want to put a disclaimer out there. I'm actually not a free speech absolutist, and I think people forget that with free speech, there's also some responsibility involved. And actually, most people, if they think about it, if they really think about it, they can't say that they're free speech absolutists. What I mean by that is with free speech, you don't have a right, for example, to incite violence. You don't have a right to get involved in a targeted bullying campaign against someone, right? Technically, those things might involve speech. Well, actually, inciting violence does involve speech, but I think most people would agree that there should be some restrictions on inciting violence. That's why I say I'm not a free speech absolutist, because you're absolute about it, then you think basically people could say absolutely anything they want with zero responsibility, zero restrictions whatsoever. I don't agree with that. But what I do believe is that free speech should be as broad ranging as possible, and include opinions that we don't like personally. That's really the test. It's often associated with Voltaire. I don't know who said it, but the line, I disagree with what you were saying, but I will fight to the death for your right to say it. I think it's often associated with Voltaire, but I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. Regardless, the principle of that is important. Um, and we really have to ask ourselves, okay, I can't stand this person. I absolutely disagree with what they're saying, but do I believe in the principles that they should have a right to say what they're saying? Even if I find it completely obnoxious, completely wrong, what have you. That's really the real test. Because it's very easy to say, I believe in free speech if we're talking about people we agree with. The real test is when it comes to people we disagree with. Now, I believe we do have a problem in this country right now. Um, and I'll get into that in a minute, but I think that JD Vance has tried to lecture Britain and more broadly Europe on this issue. Apparently, it's part of the trade deal negotiations with the US regarding free speech in this country. I do find that a little bit hypocritical because America, for all its talk about having the First Amendment and the importance of free speech, actually on Trump's watch, I would say that there are now some restrictions, especially, for example, students protesting against what Israel's doing in Gaza. Some of them have found themselves getting stripped of their scholarship. Now, if someone's breaking the law, if they're engaging in vandalism, if they're preventing other students from going about their business, um, that's different. But I do wonder how much freedom of speech is there, the way Vance would claim there is when it comes to Israel, for example. Um, I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard Americans fear leaving the country in case they have to swear loyalty to Trump as a criteria for getting back in or not. Again, you hear a lot of things going on in the internet. There's a lot of things flying around. What exactly is true, what isn't in Trump land isn't always clear. It wouldn't surprise me because Donald Trump is a wannabe dictator. It's the sort of thing he would come out with. Anyway, the point I'm making here is for all America's pontificating on free speech, I don't think we should take any lectures from the Trump administration in that regard. That having been said, we do have a problem in this country. Now, I'm going to name check a subscriber and I hope she will give me. I assume this person's a woman, could be a guy, I guess, I don't know. Please excuse me for that. But Ashley Wilson, you raised the question, it was in my assessment of the Labour Party. If the police can't monitor non-crime hate incidents, how can they monitor, um, as you put it, bigotry and hostility? Now, it's important to understand that non-crime hate incidents in this country came about in the wake of the Stephen Lawrence case as a way for police forces to monitor racial tensions in society and to look at extremist tractions, to see if there was a trajectory of extremist behaviour that could potentially lead to criminal violence. I've no problem at all with the police monitoring extremist groups, whether they be far right, whether they be Islamist, whether they be another extreme group. I would include the likes of Just Stop Oil in that regard. Any group that thinks it has a right to engage in criminality, to engage in violence, I think there's a valid argument for them being monitored, absolutely. But there's a huge difference between the police monitoring such groups or individuals in order to assess if there is a potential there for violence versus hounding people simply for using colourful language or having politically incorrect opinions. There is a huge difference. And with respect, Ashley, I'm not sure that you've really taken that into consideration because the sort of cases that we're seeing are not about people spreading racial hatred or inciting violence. We're talking about, for instance, a couple in Hertfordshire that had 6 uniformed officers turn up at the doorstep. They were held for 8 hours. 8 hours. Um, the guy's reported he's suffering PTSD as a result. Um, all because they had a dispute with the school, and the wife had used some slightly colourful language. She called one of the school staff a control freak. That's rude. Perhaps she shouldn't have said it, but I really think it's a travesty that it escalates to the police that someone's been called a name, hurt feelings. Now that's essentially what it amounts to. I strongly, strongly disagree that the police have any business being involved in something like that. And frankly, I told the school what I thought and I told the police what I thought. It ended up with the Chief Constable of Hertfordshire Police making a grovelling kind of climb down on that. Not a grovelling apology. He didn't actually apologise. I think he should have. He claimed, well, we understand this is bad optics and maybe the officers shouldn't have been uniformed. And, it was sort of a very weak attempt to admit that it was overreach. I think he should have apologised to the couple. Um, I mean, 8 hours, 10 minutes would have established exactly what was said in the thread, or even a bit longer if it was a long thread. But for me, it's a fact they were held for 8 hours is deeply, deeply troubling. And it's not even like that was just a freak case, like it was just a very bad judgment on the part of that force. And it never happens in other forces. This happens far too much. Each case is slightly different, but there's some similar characteristics. Someone has said something slightly politically incorrect or taken out of context online, and then you see police overreach. I find it deeply, deeply troubling. Um, Now, I've always said that any claims that this country is like North Korea or Russia is totally misplaced. I've lived in the communist country. I lived and worked in China twice, and it's not comparable. We're not China, but I do think I do think that freedom of speech is under attack in this country. Now, there is a left right issue with this. I think overall, the left has a worse track record. I think the left, when they get power, are more likely to censor than the right overall. That doesn't mean that the right is immune from it now. Like I say, it's Donald Trump's administration that is cracking down on civil liberties, including free speech, despite their claims to the contrary. But in the UK, honestly, I would trust. I mean, I don't think the right is spotless on this, but if I had to, if someone holds a gun to my head and said, Nathan, which side do you think is more likely to crack down on free speech? I'd have to say it's the left, because the left is always, always pontificating on racism, sexism, any ism they can think of. Um, my view on that is if someone is genuinely being bigoted in some form, if they're being racist, sexist, or otherwise bigoted, they should be challenged. They should be confronted. But I don't think you get people to reform or change their way of thinking by criminalizing them when they haven't actually committed any offense. So if someone makes a racist joke or if someone makes an unpleasant statement, they could be deemed to be sexist or racist. Is it really the right approach to get the police involved? Is it not better to just confront them and say that they're an ignorant idiot and they need to get into the real world and meet people and open their mind? I don't think you get people to change by harassing them, by getting the police involved, unless it's absolutely necessary. So, when it comes to the left-right spectrum, I think both sides don't have a clean record on this. The right is not perfect. I know the Tories right now are talking about abolishing non-crime hate incidents. Well, they had 14 years to do it. Reform probably would, but reform also has to explain, okay, you get rid of them, will you rein in on extremist groups? Because that would be the counter argument. And actually, I appreciate what you're saying. There is extremism out there, and it's unpleasant. But I strongly, strongly disagree that there's any justification for the police turning up to someone's door because they've called someone a control freak. Or, for example, because someone has said they believe biology matters. Now, a trans person might argue that's transphobic. In fact, actually, there was a case involving, I think the man's name is Harry Miller, a former police officer, who was brought through the court system because of his thoughts on the trans issue. Um, we cannot just say this is one or two cases. It's happening more and more. Um, Not so much that it's, everywhere all at once, but it is happening a lot. Now, I talk about controversial subjects in these videos. I'm opinionated. Honestly, I sometimes wonder, am I going to get, are the police going to question me about that? I shouldn't even be thinking that because I never incite violence. I never stoke up hatred against any group. Um, we shouldn't. It's strange that we're even thinking about this in what's supposedly a free country. Well, the UK is not that free. Um, I've always supported police action in certain circumstances. I think where there is a group that's planning some sort of terrorist attack, where there is a known extremist group, I'm all for monitoring that. I would also be completely in favour of monitoring people, for example, who are showing sympathy with hostile foreign actors. For example, if someone is showing sympathy to Putin's Russia, I think it would be quite valid to monitor them as a potential for potential espionage reasons, especially if they're in politics or the military. I mean, that's just common sense. If someone's praising Putin and they're coming out with constant pro Russia propaganda and they're living in the UK, I think it's quite reasonable to suspect they may be involved in espionage, even if at a low level. So that sort of monitoring I have no problem with. But even then, if some useful idiot wants to say that they admire Putin, should it be an arrestable offence? At the moment, I'd say no. I think, like I say, if they're in the military or politics, I definitely watch them closely. If they're just a regular Jill or Joe, I think it's better to just shame them. But I don't think it should necessarily be a criminal offence. And I would be a hypocrite if I said it was, because there's a lot of contentious political issues. Um, but ultimately, you cannot claim that you're for human rights and liberty and free speech simultaneously forcefully defending non-crime hate incidents the way they are right now. Whatever good intentions they had to start off with, it's very clear that they're out of control. It's very clear that police chiefs, for whatever reason, are abusing their power. I was very disappointed by the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, whose name eludes me at the moment, but he'd been held up as a role model, Bobby. He was talking about back to basics policing, focus on crime, focus on the things people care about. But he's just come out and said that he's going to really, really follow up on this, and the public should expect that every crime is monitored, except that non-crime hate incidents aren't crime. That's the irony about it. They're not actually crime. So the police really have no business getting involved. Um, I think there's a certain degree of common sense involved in this. If you have some sort of chat forum or community and they're coming out constantly with racist jokes, and then it sort of gets into the point of people saying we need to do something about this, or it gets into sort of language that could be seen as potentially on the path to inciting violence. Maybe that's something that should be monitored. I'm okay with that. But ultimately, what free speech means is not just everyone has a nice, comfortable opinion and we all agree with each other. It means by nature that it's going to be adversarial. It means that there's going to be people who say things that you don't agree with. And frankly, I think it should include the right to offend. Why? Because what is offensive is entirely subjective. What one person may see as truth, another person might find offensive. Like the trans issue is a very good point on this. I believe in biology. Now, a trans person might say, by me saying that a woman is an adult human female, or asking the question, what is a woman? They might say, I'm inciting hostility towards trans people. I don't believe I am. I don't believe I'm inciting any sort of hatred or um, or threat against trans people, but they might interpret it that way. So this is what I'm talking about. Who gets to define this? What I'd like to see is, if they're not completely abolished, I'd like to see them scaled back significantly, only used when it's absolutely necessary, where there's very real evidence that someone is potentially a danger to society. But if it's simply people having online disputes or using slightly colourful or politically incorrect language, I really think the police have no business getting involved. Frankly, people need to toughen up a bit online, and not run to the police because someone's insulted them. If someone's insulted you, throw it back at them or block them. Online those sources are available. If someone threatens you, that's a police matter. But I really think it is, yeah, I think what we're seeing, that there is definitely a problem in this country with an assault on free speech. I don't entirely agree with Toby Young of the Free Speech Union that, for example, incitement to violence is just trivial. I do think there's a problem with that. But even in that much highlighted case of the wife of the Conservative councillor, who's now in jail, is it really justified that she's in jail for 3 years for, yes, making a obnoxious post that was inciting violence, but something she immediately deleted? And when you consider that her sentence is tougher than men who commit domestic violence against their girlfriends or wives, literally, some of them get 2 years or less. Is that really justified? She's been prevented from seeing her child. I think there's many on the left that lap it up simply because she's on the right. Um, I had little sympathy with her in the beginning. I even said, okay, maybe she should get some sort of custodial sentence. But now I believe that I do question why the parole board's refusing to reduce her sentence. I do question why. I wonder, is she being held up as an example? That's deeply disturbing because it gets into the realm of essentially, potentially political persecution simply because she has conservative views on things. Um, it really doesn't make the justice system look good. I think what would have sufficed is for her to do some community service, perhaps pay a fine, perhaps attend some sort of um, community cohesion event, something like that. But really, 3 years in jail, I think, yeah, I think it's too excessive. Um, but what we're seeing is people held by the police, not going to prison, but held by the police. Which, think about it, you've come out with an opinion online, uniformed officers come to your door, they tell you to go down to the station, you're held for 8 hours, the best part of the day, you can't do anything. You can't just leave, you may have other commitments, you may have relatives that you need to bring somewhere. Um, I really, really, really question the police claiming that they have a necessity to do this. I mean, it makes you wonder, is it just a lack of common sense? Why is it they need 8 hours to investigate something? If there's a thread of comments, that can be investigated in 10 minutes if it's a short thread. Let's say 1 hour if it's a bit longer. I do not believe that they need 8 hours for that. Um, the fact that, you know, it may not be the case that people are going to jail in the UK for having opinions. In the case that I mentioned, it was explicitly for inciting violence. That doesn't mean what we're saying is okay. It doesn't mean it's okay for police to go to people's homes to hold them. That's bad enough. So that's my take on it. Like I say, both the left and the right don't have a squeaky clean record with this. Particularly in the United States, the right, I think they want to crack down on criticism of Israel and of the Trump administration. But in the UK, we have a Labour government. This is being overused right now. If Starmer wants to really pitch to reform voters, he needs to be more outspoken on this issue. And a final point, there's absolutely no reason why the police can't monitor extremism without abusing their power, without taking away people's free speech, which, like I say, includes the right to have controversial opinions. If you really dislike what someone's saying, challenge them, expose them, criticize them, but don't run to the police. It's pathetic. Unless you genuinely feel that your life is threatened, then I think there's no justification for that. So this is an extremely important issue. It's something that gets down to basic liberty. And I would say if you're of the opinion that non-crime hate incidents are completely fine and the situation right now is completely fine and justified, I would say that you are against liberty. You are against free speech because that is what we're seeing being violated right now.